Hello fans and friends across the universe, welcome to my YouTube channel From Me to You. My name's Keir Smith and today I want to offer my reaction to the article that appeared in The Guardian online yesterday. The article dealt with the breakup of the Beatles from a recent interview with Paul McCartney, and Paul talks openly about how the band broke up and mainly that it was John that instigated the split, and it caused quite a strong reaction, not least from Mean Mr Mayo, whose YouTube channel I love and I've spent many a happy hour watching his excellent content. But I thought he was a bit strong in his criticism of Paul, accusing him of being petty and trying to win small battles, so I wanted to throw my 2p worth into the argument. So in this article in The Guardian, Paul said, "I didn't instigate the split, that was our Johnny." Now, first and foremost, this is old news, quite literally 51 years old. I've read this story in countless Beatles books. I've seen so many interviews with Paul McCartney where he tells this story, and to be fair to him, he tells this story in pretty much the same way every single time. Now, I appreciate there is a little bit of promotional work going on here, considering that the Beatles Let It Be reissue is coming out on Friday, but I don't think he's bending the truth in any way, as some people are suggesting. As I say, he pretty much tells this story the same way every single time. It's always a little bit frustrating for me when I see a new interview with Paul McCartney, because sadly it's the same old questions and the same old answers. And I'm sure that that has something to do with Paul's PR people. You don't get to interview Paul McCartney and ask him anything you like, more's the pity. But going back to the article in The Guardian, Paul goes on to say, "This was my band, this was my job, this was my life, so I wanted it to continue." And in Mean Mr Mayo's video, he was suggesting that Paul was being maybe a little bit egotistical here, saying this was my band, this was my job, my life, and suggesting that Paul was the man and that he was the only one. But I didn't see it that way. It just seemed to me that Paul was talking openly and passionately about himself and how he saw things. You know, Paul was very, very proud of the Beatles and their output. And it's worth remembering that Paul was extremely proud of his songwriting partnership with his best friend, John Lennon. There are many factors as to why the Beatles broke up, and everyone has an opinion on this. But for me, there has always been one clear standout moment when the Beatles truly divided. And that was on February the 3rd, 1969, when John, George and Ringo signed with Alan Klein to be the Beatles' new manager, and Paul didn't. He wanted Lee Eastman, Linda's dad, to manage the group, but the other three didn't want to go that way, suggesting that it would be too biased for Paul. And Paul said in the Beatles anthology that he could understand that. In this article in The Guardian, Paul was asked about his decision to go solo, and Paul said, "Stop right there. I'm not the person who instigated the split. Oh, no. John walked into a room one day and said, 'I'm leaving the Beatles.' Is that instigating the split or not?" And apparently John announced that he was leaving the group on the 20th of September 1969, just a week before the release of the Beatles' Abbey Road album, and just a week after returning from the Live Peace in Toronto show that he did with Eric Clapton, Klaus Voormann, Alan White and Yoko Ono. And the Live Peace in Toronto album would be later released in December 1969. And John had told Alan Klein about his desire to leave the group, but Klein had asked him to keep any talk of a potential split under wraps while he concluded business deals regarding improving the Beatles' royalty rates and their earnings from that, as well as other things. And I always think it's worth noting that when we talk about the lead up to the breakup of the Beatles, that Paul McCartney was the last Beatle to release a solo project. By the end of 1969, John had released 4 recordings with Yoko Ono: 2 Virgins, Life with Lions, The Wedding Album and Live Peace in Toronto. Now, low-key as those recordings were, the first 3 were very experimental and avant-garde, but he'd also done the Bedding for Peace with Yoko Ono on their honeymoon in Amsterdam, and that yielded the Give Peace a Chance single. And then in early 1970, John released his Instant Karma single. George as well, he'd released 2 instrumental albums with Electronic Sound and Wonderwall Music, and the Beatles' last recording session took place on the 3rd of January 1970. John wasn't present, it was just George, Ringo and Paul perfecting George's song from Let It Be, I Me Mine. And then in early 1970, even Ringo released his first solo album, which was a covers album of old standards, Sentimental Journey. Still no solo release from Paul though. And so it was clear with these projects that John, George and Ringo were starting to break away from the band, and Paul himself had started recording what would become the McCartney Album in late 1969. And when he spoke to the other three Beatles and Alan Klein about releasing this album as his first solo project, he was asked to push the release date back so as not to affect the sales of the upcoming Beatles Let It Be album, which was due in May 1970. And this annoyed Paul, and there's a famous story about Ringo being sent round to talk to Paul about pushing the release date back, and Paul got pretty angry about things and apparently threw Paul Ringo out of his house. And this is where the big bombshell really happened, because the McCartney album would be released on the 17th of April 1970, but on the 9th of April the album was released to the press. And Paul didn't want to have to do a big press conference whereby he'd have to sit in front of the press and answer questions about his own future or the band's future. So he and Peter Brown devised a question and answers list of questions that he thought the press would ask him, and he released that with the album to serve the press to devastating effect. So here's some of the questions and answers that Paul McCartney and Peter Brown put together. Are you planning a new album or single with the Beatles? Paul's answer, no. Is this album a rest away from the Beatles or the start of a solo career? Paul's answer, time will tell. Being a solo album means it's the start of a solo career, and not being done with the Beatles means it's a rest, so it's both. Is your break from the Beatles temporary or permanent, due to personal difference or musical ones? Paul's answer, personal differences, business differences, musical differences, but most of all because I have a better time with my family. Temporary or permanent, I don't know. Do you see a time when Lennon-McCartney becomes an active songwriting partnership again? Paul's answer, no. What is your relationship with Klein? Paul's answer, it isn't. I'm not in contact with him and he does not represent me in any way. Pretty heavy stuff. And so we got the famous headline on the 10th of April 1970, Paul quits the Beatles. John was absolutely furious. He thought that Paul had no right to announce the breakup of the Beatles, and he thought that it was a cheap way of promoting the McCartney album. But if you read the question and answers list, at no point does Paul say that the Beatles are breaking up. He gives an honest and open account of where the Beatles were at that time. It had been a long, long time. Paul didn't sign with Alan Klein like John, George and Ringo did on February the 3rd, 1969. This was now April 1970. It had been 14 months of not being able to say anything or break free from this horrible situation that he found himself in. And I truly think that the McCartney album was a way of Paul trying to break free and do something after the Beatles. The Beatles hadn't been together since the 3rd of January 1970. There was no plans to do anything in the future. And I think Paul had just had enough and decided to crack on with things. And so in 1970, in London's High Court of Justice, Paul sought dissolution of the band's contractual partnership after John, George and Ringo had appointed Alan Klein to preside over the Beatles' financial affairs. And in 1971, the High Court ruled in McCartney's favour. It was the messiest of breakups. It's often been referred to as a divorce. And I don't think for 1 minute that Paul McCartney wanted to sue John, George and Ringo, but he really couldn't see any other way out. Had Paul not sued John, George and Ringo and Alan Klein, we may never have seen the wonderful releases that we have, like the Beatles anthology, like the One album or the Love album, because it would have all belonged to Alan Klein and he could have done with it what he wanted. And later on in 1973, John, George and Ringo had fallen foul of Klein's business dealings and his crooked ways, and they would not renew his contract, and Alan Klein would duly sue the Beatles for around about £5 million. And later on in 1973, in an interview, John was asked about Alan Klein, and John said, "Let's say Paul's suspicions were possibly right." Don't be too forthcoming with an apology there, John. So, who broke up the Beatles? Paul himself said that he let the cat out of the bag, but I think after much deliberation, it was the only way to solve things. It was painful having to take his friends, his bandmates to court, but it all worked out for the best in the end, I think. And Paul took a lot of stick in the following years for the breakup of the Beatles, but to me, he always took it on the chin and got on with things manfully. And it would be super interesting to hear John and George's point of view now, but as we know, sadly, that isn't possible. It would be nice to hear a new Ringo interview and get his take on things, but they always seem to go to Paul when they want to discuss all things Beatles, purely because he attracts the wider audience, I guess. But let me know what you think. Please leave your comments below. Who do you think was responsible for the breakup of the Beatles, and were they right to do so? Please give the video the thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel. There'll be lots more to come. Thanks as always for watching. See you next time.